Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive has begun, and while its forces are still reporting their gains in meters, experts say the progress is credible. As Ukrainian forces push to take territory in Russian-occupied south and east, they're relying in part on Western-supplied weapons like these Leopard tanks. Soldiers report liberating a series of villages, but Russian military bloggers say some of these are still being contested. Russia's overall response could depend on a power struggle within its military leadership, as well as on the resolve of Ukraine's allies, many of which are currently taking part in NATO's largest ever air exercise. We're asking, Ukraine's counteroffensive, how will Putin react? Welcome to the Point. Here are our guests. Marina Henke is director of Hertie's Center of International Security and an author of acclaimed works on security policy. Wilfried Jilge is an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe and Russia. And it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague from DW, Vladimir Esipov. He serves on our Russian language desk and is a valued frequent guest on the program. And Marina, if I may, let me start with you. And NATO's Secretary General is expressing what sounded like measured optimism when asked about Ukraine's counteroffensive. He said it is gaining ground. He does see progress. What's your take? Would you agree?
Well, I think first and foremost, we can say it has begun. But some folks, they expected a D-Day-like offensive. So, like all the different brigades that were trained now over, like months on end would storm into Russian fortified territory and take over, kind of like big swath of land in one go. And this is not at all what we see. We see actually much more operations, small operations, where the Ukrainians are actually testing the ground. They are testing where are holes in the fortifications, and also like what's the morale like? Where are the strong troops? Where are the weaker troops? Where can they actually gain some ground and make further progress? That's what I think we're seeing. I think the progress is very, very small. To me, that's no surprise. So, I'm not a pessimist, but I don't think, we can speak of a major success or victory on the Ukrainian side so far.
So you're saying essentially a little bit of expectation management is warranted. Ukraine is attacking from multiple directions. That's part of the test, perhaps, that you described. Does it also indicate a sense of confidence on the part of Ukrainian leadership?
So the only territory that has strategic value that Russia has captured in this entire war is the southern eastern corridor and basically the land bridge to Crimea. And of course, Ukraine wants to recapture that piece of land. And exactly, we see that the operations are going from 3 different directions. And so far, however, I think it's really too early to get to any kind of conclusion and say, if any of both sides is stronger or, having the better equipment.
Mm-hmm. And Wilfried, Russia has been making heavy use of air power, while Ukraine is still waiting for the combat aircraft, the F-16s, that it has long been asking for from its Western allies. How much of a disadvantage is Ukraine under because of that?
Yes, it is a disadvantage that Ukraine does not have these air power. But we should take into account that no one of the sides has the superiority in the air. That is absolutely the case, and the Ukrainians were capable to make bigger operations even without that dominating the airspace. And we should also see what we can take already from the first time of the offensive. Ukrainian high-precise artillery system is working. Ukrainians successfully already hard-hit what is maybe more important than some villages at the moment. They hard-hit already ammunition command centers, also huge units of the Russians, what is, of course, not shown in Moscow and not said by the speakers of the Ministry of Defense.
Speaking of what's said and not said in Moscow, Vladimir, it may be early days, but Vladimir Putin says that he can already judge the counteroffensive to be a failure, and he said Ukraine's tank and troop losses are, quote-unquote, catastrophic. Whether or not that is true, what effect would you expect it to have?
It's, as it said, it's too early to say it. We know a lot too little about the counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side. We know a little bit about the small progress of the Ukrainian troops on the ground, but it's too little time gone since this began. And the other side, we have create a kind of hype around this counteroffensive, the huge expectation on the side of the Western public, because the talks of the Western weapon delivery to the Ukrainians was for months, and it's created a big expectation in the public, and not only in the Ukraine, but in the Western public as well, that we have a kind of wonder weapons to deliver to the Ukraine, and Ukraine will outrun the Russians, which is obviously not happening. So we have to wait and see how these things will develop on the ground.
So are you saying that Putin, with this declaration that it's all a failure, is essentially doing counter hype? And will that have an effect in Russia? He still has the support of most of the population.
But there's no hype on the Russian side. There's a quite very, how they say it, very realistic, not realistic, but very small expectations. So they have to defend their lands. They are not on the attack this time. So Ukrainians have to go in to take the grounds again, which is occupied by Russian forces. But on the Russian side, there is no huge hype in terms of an expectation of this defensive campaign.
I want to come back to that a little bit later on, but I'd like to first take a look at what I hope we will see shortly on the screens behind us, namely the biggest industrial disaster that Europe has seen for a number of years, the breach of Ukraine's Novakhochova Dam. It is thought that Russia was behind this cataclysm. The logic of the action, though, Wilfried, seems a little bit dubious because, targeting civilians, that's usual for Russia. But the fact is that its own forces' positions have been inundated by this flood. So would you expect, nonetheless, that this is, a Russian action? And will it help or hurt Russia overall?
I think there are two probable versions when we look at the aims of Russia and what happened. I think one is credible, that Russia tried really to fleet parts of the lower Dnipro region in order to push out the Ukrainians who stood already on the islands on the Dnipro and attacked the left bank. And they really effectively attacked it already. So they did many raids on the other side. So for the Russians, it was a problem that they had also to care not only about the east, not about Zaporizhia, but also about the lower Dnipro region. And I think they wanted, there is also ground to think that they had the intention to do something to block that direction for the Ukrainians, but not with that dimension. I think the things went as they did not expect. I think they want to damage something, and they want to let water down, but maybe not the whole thing. And the second version is also in the responsibility of the Russians, because the Russians mined the dam when they occupied the territory. The Russians did not manage regularly and professionally the water control of the dam, so the dam was under pressure, and if they did some not very good things, that could also lead to a full damage of the dam. So Russian, in both cases, even if there would not have been a clear intention to use it for military reasons, Russia is responsible for that, what happened, because they did not let other organizations in, they did not professionally manage that dam.
Let me add something to this, because I think a very important component of the dam is also that Russia wants to break the will of the Ukrainian people, right? So they have shown this over since the war started, but in particular during the winter when they attacked the power plants and really wanted to hurt the people. And I think here this is just another occasion to literally send the message. We, do no longer respect you, even the civilians, and we want you to hurt. And, that's why the flooded plains and also it's just a massive humanitarian catastrophe is part and parcel of the strategy.
Say a word about, Vladimir?
Sorry, if I may add to this, it strikes on the energy infrastructure as an important component of this war. So it's not only about the power plants in Ukraine. Dam in Kakhovka is Nord Stream pipeline as well. It was against the energy as a goal in this war.
And would you, Vladimir, also assume that Russia was behind this action? And if so, what message is it trying to send with that?
The message is clearly it's all in war, so every weapon is okay for Russia, not the nuclear weapon, or not yet. We don't know what will happen yet, but it's like it's another one piece of Russian warfare, conventional weapon, information war, and then the war on the energy infrastructure. So on every single piece of front, Russia can strike with whatever weapon they're striking.
Marina, certainly the wider effects of this breach of the dam look very concerning, and not only for Ukraine. The water level has gone down significantly in the Kakhovka reservoir, which feeds very critical canals, both for Ukrainian agriculture, and Ukraine, of course, is the breadbasket, the wheat supplier to much of the world, but also the nuclear power plant mentioned by Wilfried at Zaporizhzhia. So, you know, very, very significant damage here for quite a long period of time into the future.
It's an absolute disaster. It's an absolute humanitarian, but also, you know, just a strategic disaster. And what, you know, like worries me the most, or where, you know, like I'm very critical of, is also that, you know, like there's actually not enough presence now by international organizations, for example, by the United Nations, to really call this out. Because this is something, you know, like that is, sure, everything is legitimate in war and love, apparently, but here really like to put this on a pedestal and say like what Russia is doing is not okay, because it will affect, as you just mentioned, every single region on this planet, again in Africa, again in the Middle East, where you don't have the grain supplies. But in those regions, you have a lot of folks who still believe that NATO is actually, or the United States is the aggressor, and Russia is the weaker force, and it was forced to launch this war. And so I think, you know, like this moment really needs to be used by responsible figures in the international community to really portray that Russia is using, you know, like weapons that are just against every single possible moral clause out there.
Meanwhile, in Russia, we are seeing a developing power struggle. Neither Putin's propaganda nor dramatic displays of captured tanks, such as those being shown on Russian TV, belie the fact that Russia has not had the success it expected when it began its invasion. As pressure mounts, the ongoing infighting between the defense ministry and the private military company Wagner has now come to a head, with the former telling the latter its volunteers must become contractors to the defense ministry.
The Akhmat military unit and its commander are the first to sign a contract with Russia's defense ministry. This places the army of Ramzan Kadyrov under the supervision of the Russian army. The order also affects Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner group. The mercenary force, an important pillar for Russia's army, was last deployed in the battle for the strategically and symbolically important city of Bakhmut. Now Prigozhin refuses to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. He says that Minister Shoigu has so far been unable to lead his own troops. Meanwhile, there is also speculation about whether the defense minister himself has fallen out of favor with Putin. Is the power struggle in the Kremlin intensifying?
And let me pass that question straight over to Vladimir. Is the power struggle intensifying, and what are its larger consequences?
In my impression, yes, we have a power struggle, not inside the Kremlin, but between the Russian army and the private group Wagner, which is not part of the Russian government, so it's kind of outside of the government structure. And it's fascinating to see how quick Yevgeny Prigozhin started to build up his political campaign inside
Head
of Russia.
The Wagner group, yeah.
He is not only on the front, he traveled to Russia in the recent weeks and gave a press conference and talked about Russian politics, about domestic politics, about a bigger broad of questions, not only military strategy in the Ukraine. And it's a kind of, I would say, rising star of the Russian politics on the social media, because he is dealing quite professional with social media and using his media empire quite well. And he reminds me a little bit on Donald Trump, because in the beginning of Trump's political campaign was a big part of the establishment were like smiling and didn't take him seriously. The same is happening with Prigozhin right now, but I could not I think that it's possible that he would start a political career in
So
Russia.
that sounds like you're telling us the person threatened here is not the defense minister threatened by Prigozhin, but perhaps Putin himself?
They are too early to say it, but there's wild speculations going on the Russian internet about the strategy of Prigozhin and his goals, and the possible powers inside of Russian politics who might support him, because he would not start this kind of political assault on the Minister of Defense and the political campaign inside of Russia without a very strong support from very high-level circles in Russia, inside of Russian politics.
Wilfried, meanwhile, those who try to read the tea leaves from the Kremlin are very interested in a photo that was recently publicized that shows the Russian president quite ostentatiously giving the cold shoulder to the defense minister, though they were formerly considered quite good friends. What are we to make of that, if anything?
I cannot so much make of that, because I think much more important is what is the consequence of that struggle. And the consequence of that struggle is that the problem between the organization of the military, of the attacks of the regular army on the one side, on the one hand, and the Prigozhin company on the other hand, will continue. So what Putin tried to do is he tried to balance something. He gave his Minister of Defense with a proclaimed subordination of private companies under the army. He gave him something to protect himself, but at the same time we see that Prigozhin is building up further his media presence. So nothing is resolved on the ground, and that is important for Putin, because if on the ground the mismanagement on the combined weapon attack management, if that is continuing, that is a problem for Putin in the end, because that can lead for gaps for the Ukrainian army which can be used.
What's your take on all this, Marina?
So, now from a Western perspective, I think there are two big takeaways. On the one hand, I think the infighting between the Wagner groups and the regular military will in one form or another negatively impact what happens in Ukraine. So this is not an asset, but it's actually a disadvantage for Russia. But on the other hand, so somebody like Prigozhin is not somebody who's pro-Western or, wants to end this war. To the contrast, one could interpret that he's even more hardline than Shoigu and maybe even the current establishment of the military, and he will also pursue this very hostile anti-Western, anti-NATO attitude. So even if there is a power struggle in Russia that, maybe might even lead to, this is now very futuristic, but to the collapse of the Putin regime, that does not mean that then we have a regime that is actually, much more friendly to NATO's interests.
Vladimir, a widely quoted report from Bloomberg says that Russia's elites no longer believe, or many of the elite no longer believe, that Putin's war on Ukraine is winnable. Do you see signs that that is true? And again, what would that matter? What would it mean for Putin? What would it mean for the outcome of the war?
We reported a huge increase of alcohol consumptions in Russia in the recent weeks and months. So it might be connected to this disillusion of the Russian elite on the political leadership, because alcohol is the last measure to stay mentally healed in
They're drinking their sorrows away.
They're drinking a lot. So, but on the serious side, it's interesting what the chief of Russia Today said last week. All of a sudden, on a Russian talk show, Ms. Simonian told that maybe it's time for a ceasefire in the Ukraine, and maybe it could be another referendum in the areas of the Ukraine which are occupied by Russian forces. And if the people who are living there don't want to stay with Russia, let them go free back to the Ukraine. So it's a very new tone on the Russian establishment, which of the part of the Russian establishment which was very loyal to President Putin. It was very pro-war all the time since the war began. And all of a sudden you hear such noises on the political scene.
What does that mean? Is Putin's position shaky?
It's not shaking, but it's obviously in the part of the establishment there are some movement, I would suppose. It's not on the surface, it's under surface, and it's only different sides of this, but there's something is changing.
Meanwhile, the West has repeatedly promised to support Ukraine as long as it takes. NATO is currently carrying out the largest air maneuver in its history. A clear signal to Russia. Will Putin take note?
Air Defender 23 is the largest deployment exercise of air forces in NATO's history. Almost all member nations are taking part in the maneuver under German leadership. According to the Bundeswehr, around 10,000 soldiers and 250 aircraft are taking part. The USA is participating with 100 aircraft. The participants want to show that they can defend Europe against air attacks. The Allies are primarily concerned with the question of whether the US can deploy forces to Europe quickly enough in an emergency. During the exercises, the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad will be carefully flown around to avoid any provocation, as the Russian side is also practicing for the event of war in the Baltic Sea. Exercises of the Russian fleet began in early June. Up to 40 ships and boats, 25 aircraft and about 3,500 soldiers are to be involved, the Russian military said. What signals do these exercises send out?
And I'll pass that question straight to you, Wilfried. What message is this sending?
I think it is an important message of deterrence that NATO tries to build up and update its capabilities for air defense. And also we have to see that the aircraft potential of NATO is one of the most important parts of the message with what the US communicated to the Kremlin in the autumn last year when they said, if you will use means of mass destruction, you should know that we are capable and ready to shoot Russian troops out with all what that means. So that is very important. And I do not think that it has a direct impact of the war of Russia against Ukraine. But it is important because we should see Putin began the campaign against Ukraine in a framework of a greater design in the south, actually to challenge NATO. So the things are also important for our security in the future.
Vladimir, how do you think this message will be received in Moscow?
I don't think it's a huge importance right now for the Russian leadership, because we talk here about the war in the Ukraine, which is going since more than 1 year. And the message Russia sending back to Europe, they still trying to do whatever they want in the Ukraine with all the rockets on Kiev and other cities, which are being fired every night, and all the bombs and all the civil victims. So that the fact that 100 or 200 Western airplanes are going around about in the German airspace does not change anything on the ground in Ukraine. So the message is probably received in Kremlin about this deterrence strategy, but they still on doing whatever they want in the Ukraine.
Marina, respond to that if you like, but I'd also like to say this. A cynic might say, people in Eastern Europe and the Baltic republics can perhaps sleep a little bit more soundly now at night after watching all these planes up in the sky. But what does it do for Ukraine itself?
Well, I think one critical component of this entire war is actually American and NATO support of Ukraine. Let's face it, without the support, Ukraine would no longer exist as it exists today. So what NATO does, whatever it does, matters to the Ukraine war, because basically as long as NATO is united and supports Ukraine, Russia cannot win this war. Period. And so here, by being able to stage this exercise and, signaling that NATO is serious also about its air power, I think it supports indirectly the Ukrainian effort. Because let's not forget, Russia has as an objective to divide NATO. We can see this, in so many different facets, but one of them is that it was actually actively involved in France. That was just spilled yesterday by the foreign minister there, having fake websites and propagating that, this was basically a NATO-initiated war, not a Russian-initiated war. And by signaling that NATO is united in this exercise, I think, it strengthens Ukrainian positions.
You wanted to respond?
I think that the people in the Baltic states and around the globe and in Ukraine and Eastern Europe will sleep well only when Russia becomes a normal state, democratic state. But it's not about the maneuvers, it's not about military plane or NATO. It's about being normal country.
Okay, I think it should be one component, yes? That is one component to strengthen deterrence, but what should be, of course, done in the future is to see that Ukraine is also important for our security, so we should supply Ukraine actually with more air defense.
F-16s? There's
Yes, of
slightly larger chance that President Biden has said he's willing to see Ukrainian pilots trained on F-16s.
Yes, of course.
Will they be a game changer?
No, at the moment not for the next months of that offensive. But the problem is if you not begin today to do that and to train Ukrainian soldiers, you will not have it even next year.
Let me just very quickly come back to our title, if I may, Marina. We ask counteroffensive. How will Putin react?
I think we will just see more of the same. I don't think there will be necessarily an intensification of the war effort. I think it will be, ending up in a frozen conflict that will be with us for, quite some time going forward.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Check out our YouTube website and let us know what you think about the program. We're eager to hear from you.